Excited. A big thanks to George Emery for getting this all together. He is so good about calling up his friends and saying, hey! So we really appreciate you, Chris, and you, Bill, coming today to join us for the afternoon and the evening. So I'm going to let retired Vice Admiral George Emery come up and give you a little bit of an introduction. We will have a wine and cheese reception after, so please stick around. And you're going to be here to sign some books?
Yes, all these books have to go.
Okay. So George, thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Thank you, Mary Lou. Hi, Bill. It's a great pleasure to welcome back to Kennebunkport and to Graves, Lewis T. Graves Memorial Public Library these two folks, Bill, and who is that over there? Chris Martin. They've been here before, they loved it before, but they love this place. Bill has a soft spot here. It all came about as a result of the first time that he joined us and lots of folks here in Kennebunkport at the Kennebunk River Club to tell us about how he put together this idea and how he built this book called The Lincoln Letter. That's the letter that Doris Kearns Goodman said was the best book he ever wrote. But he says what was so great about that day is he shook hands with the first president of the United States he ever met.
Yes.
George H.W. Bush. And had a chance to talk to, perhaps not for a very long period of time, but at least to chat with Barbara and George.
Right.
And he told me that, and I've never forgotten it. He said, it's a wonderful thing. Then, just about 2 months before COVID shut everything down, he was right here, telling us about his current book, his up-to-date current book, that is, his bestseller of the moment, which was
Bound for Gold.
Bound for Gold.
Yes.
Which is the story of California gold rush, of course. And it was a great story. He's a great storyteller. I wasn't sure, but I particularly like the fact that he said that he took this idea of a mischief of a San Francisco bodega after my wife. He might spend a lot of time at sea, and that didn't.
That isn't true. She ran the general store.
So, but this gentleman is just a wonderful guy. He's a super storyteller. I know if you've seen him and heard him before, it's great. He's a Harvard graduate. He got his Master of Fine Arts. Is that what you say that? Master
Yes.
From USC, University of Southern California. He's written so many wonderful books. I remember Cape Cod and Back Bay best, but I loved Citizen Washington. And of course, you can't not, if you're in my position, you can't not like his very best book, Annapolis. Ladies and gentlemen, may I introduce Bill Martin to you?
Thank you, George. Thank you. Thank you for that introduction, George. It's always great to be here. I remember the president, not only was it the first president that I ever met, George W. Bush, he was also the first president I ever put to sleep. Because while I was speaking, and it was a packed house, it was a big crowd, and I was keeping an eye on them down in the front seats there in the front row, and occasionally he started to nod off, which is acceptable with a man in his 90s at that point. And Barbara kept going like this. She stayed awake through the whole thing, but that was a real honor to have. As I toasted to him before I spoke about Lincoln, well, what happened was we got there to the beach club and
Kennebunk River Club.
Kennebunk River Club, and you asked, or someone asked, would you like a glass of wine? And I said, sure. And my wife said, sure. And so we each got a glass of white wine, and then word ran through the crowd that the president was coming. And because we didn't know up until the last minute. And Chris said to me, you're about to meet the President of the United States. Put your wine glass down. I said, okay. So I put the wine glass down, and first in came Barbara, and she sat down next to me, and she said, well, are you nervous? And I said, well, no, I'm prepared. She said, well, you know, this could be an audition. And I said, would you like me to sing? And she said, oh, you sing? You know, my George sings, and here he is now. And the president was wheeled in, and everybody, many of you in the room perhaps, all clustered around him, shook his hand. He was one of the members of this community, and a beloved member of this community. And everyone shook hands with him, and then I started to drift over. And one of the Secret Service agents said to him, would you like anything, Mr. President? And he immediately said, I'll have a glass of wine. And I looked at my wife and I said, see? And I grabbed my glass of wine, and as soon as he had one, I was able to toast to the 41st president as I speak about the 16th president. And we clinked glasses, and that was a nice moment. And he, yes. So thank you for that. Thank all of you for that. And thank all of you for inviting me back to Kennebunkport. I am talking today about my newest novel, December 41. The idea for this novel came from the movies. You know, we get ideas in many different ways when we write novels, from something we might have heard in school years ago to a good opening line. You know, we just met someone who remembers us we first met while traveling in Ireland when I was researching a novel back in 1984, a novel called The Rising of the Moon, a novel that was born of nothing more than a good first line. I didn't know what I was going to write in that particular summer, and I started scrolling down good opening lines, looking for inspiration. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times, sounded too familiar. Call Me Ishmael had a familiar ring to it, and I'd never name a character Ishmael in a book. So then I wrote, Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. The opening lines of Catholic confession. And the response is prompted, how long has it been since your last confession? And the penitent says, 6 weeks and 3 days. And the priest almost falls out of the box. 6 weeks and 3 days. It's a signal. The priest has been raising money for the Irish Rebellion, and now the rebel has come to collect that money and buy guns in Boston and get the guns to Ireland. And the whole novel came to life. And then we managed to do a little bit of research by going to Ireland. I decided long ago, when I was writing my second novel, which was about an organ transplant, and I was watching my first kidney transplant in an operating room saying, I don't think I want to watch this much longer. From now on, I am only going to write novels in which the research is fun. So when you write a book about Ireland, you get to go to Ireland and drink in the pubs and listen to the traditional music. And so that was what we did, and that was how we met way back in 1984 in the Arran View House in Doolin in County Clare, a memorable meeting.
Small world.
Small world is right. But this book was born in the movies. It was the movie Darkest Hours with Gary Oldman as Winston Churchill. Excellent movie. If you haven't seen it, go and see it. And there's a scene in the movie where Oldman, as Churchill, goes down into the basement of his War Department headquarters, calls Franklin Roosevelt on a secure line, and begs Roosevelt for help. It's May of 1940. France is falling. The German army is closing in on the British Expeditionary Force in Dunkirk. And Churchill is desperate for any kind of help to save England. And Franklin Roosevelt on the other end of the line says, "I can't help you, Winston. American politics ties my hands. I've done all that I can. Good luck." Churchill hangs up the phone, and we cut back to a long shot of this man crushed and defeated. It's the middle of the movie, the midpoint, that moment when the character has to confront something new and perhaps even more devastating than he's ever confronted before, and this will draw out of him even more resolve. This is how stories work, and there it is, right in the middle of the story. He's slouched in despair. And as I was watching that scene, I thought to myself, in a year and a half, right after Pearl Harbor, Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt will appear together on the south portico of the White House to light the national community Christmas tree of the United States and express the unity of the British and American people in the war against fascism. And what a target they will make. There it was. I said, oh man, this is too good. A German assassin is going to try to kill them both on the night that Roosevelt lights the Christmas tree. Now, you need some historical underpinning to support an idea like this, even if it never happened, and we know it never happened, and it doesn't happen in the book. Because when you read a historical novel by me, I don't change the history, but my characters are changed by the history. One of the first things that I did was read a book by a man named Mike Riley, who was FDR's anchorman, the Secret Service agent who was always at his side. And Riley described those first few weeks in Washington and said that while the Army was worried about some sort of paramilitary attack by German forces on the White House, that's why there were machine guns on the White House roof and soldiers all over the place, the Secret Service was worried about exactly what I was thinking of writing about: a plot by an assassin or a team of assassins to kill the president. Once I had that, I knew I could go forward. But now, where do I begin a story like this? Well, there are a few days that have more world historical impact than December 8th, 1941. And so I wrote an introduction in which I imagined myself almost as a newsreel camera traveling around the globe. You used to see those famous newsreels that would begin with the spinning world, and in my imagination, the camera begins by traveling across the international date line, the place that divides yesterday from today out in the far Pacific. It's December 8th. The camera spins down into Tokyo at about 2 in the morning, Tokyo time, as the Japanese foreign minister is carrying a sheet of paper. It is the suspension of diplomatic relations between Japan and the United States. He presents it to the emperor. He tells the emperor, in half an hour, this sheet of paper will be delivered to the Secretary of State in Washington. In 60 minutes, the bombs will start falling in Hawaii. The emperor approves. Our camera picks up, travels up and over China, now subjugated by the Japanese troops. It continues to travel north and west. It picks up a troop train traveling across the wide and empty expanse of Asian Russia. It speeds ahead over Moscow. It arrives at the line where the Germans and the Russians are in their death struggle. The Germans have advanced to within 12 miles of Moscow, and now the Russians are finally stopping them. They are finally, after 6 months of defeat, pushing the Germans back. The camera continues to travel over the Ukraine, over the pine forests of East Prussia, and down into a dank, poured concrete headquarters called the Wolfschanz, Adolf Hitler's Eastern Front headquarters. On the morning of December 8th, Adolf Hitler orders Goebbels to convene the Reichstag. He's going to make a speech because the night before he had gotten word that Pearl Harbor had been bombed. Now, Hitler was in a very gloomy mood on the night of December 7th until he got that word, because the Russians were finally fighting back. And his generals, he did not believe, were up to the winter crisis. But now he exults when he hears the news of Pearl Harbor. Now, and Goebbels wrote about this in his journals, now we cannot be defeated because now we have an ally who has not lost a war in 3,000 years. Hitler could engage even then in this kind of self-deceptions that would be one of his downfalls. The camera travels continually to the west. It passes over subjugated Europe. It arrives in England, where on the morning of December 8th, Winston Churchill is informing his staff that they must convene Parliament so that they can declare war on Japan. Because the night before, Churchill was having dinner at his table at Chequers, the Prime Minister's country retreat. The butler came up to Churchill and whispered in his ear. Immediately, Churchill leapt up, ran up the stairs, called Franklin Roosevelt, and said, "Mr. President, what's all this I hear about Pearl Harbor?" To which FDR responds, "It's quite true, Winston. We're all in the same boat now." And as Churchill would later write, "I went to sleep contemplating the immense economic, industrial, and military might of the United States, and I slept the sleep of the saved and thankful. England would survive." The camera picks up and continues across the Atlantic. It arrives in Washington. On the morning of December 8, 1941, Washington, D.C. is covered in a cold, damp mist. The camera dips down through the mist, down to the White House, into the windows on the second floor, where Butler Alonzo Field is carrying, played by Forrest Whitaker in the movie you might remember, where Alonzo Field is carrying the clothes that President Roosevelt is going to wear that morning to deliver his speech. He's going to dress in diplomatic clothes, swallow-tailed coat, striped trousers. This is a moment for that kind of wardrobe. He steps into the president's bedroom, and Roosevelt is sitting up in bed. I like to imagine that we know he's editing his speech that morning. I like to think that he has just made what is perhaps the most famous edit in the history of American rhetoric. He has cut out the words that had been typed into the speech, "in world history," put in a little caret and written in the words, "in infamy." That morning, he made the edit. Now begins the process of dressing the president, who has, as we know, polio. The process of dressing him takes about an hour every day. He lays out flat on the bed. Alonzo Field pulls on the leg braces, 2 stainless steel braces hinged at the knee, bound to the body by straps at the thighs and at the waist. They are painful and truly an agony to wear, but Franklin Roosevelt will not appear in front of an audience except wearing the braces and standing upright, which he has learned to do with help and with the braces. It takes about an hour. He gets dressed. They wheel him downstairs and put him into his limousine. Now, there's an urban myth that I think is actually pretty accurate, that Franklin Roosevelt that day traveled from the White House to the Capitol in a limousine that had been owned by Al Capone. The reason for this is that the armored limousines that the president was going to be traveling in soon was still under construction in Detroit. However, over there at the Treasury, they had Capone's limousine because, of course, they grabbed him for income tax evasion. So they grabbed all of his assets. So they brought the limousine over. They put the president into it. It was an armored limousine. They put 3 Secret Service agents on each side. Even though it was a cold, gloomy day, they only wore sport coats because if they had to move quickly for some reason, they wanted to be unencumbered by overcoats. And the car heads out onto Pennsylvania Avenue. There is a crowd along the avenue, but they're quiet. There are soldiers every 5 feet along the avenue. There are snipers on the roofs of the buildings, FBI snipers. The manhole covers on Pennsylvania Avenue have been welded shut. There has never been, according to contemporary reports, there has never been a day of such tension in Washington, D.C. since the March morning when Abraham Lincoln followed that route to the Capitol to take the oath of office for his first term. The vehicle pulls the president in under the Capitol into an entrance that's designed particularly for him so that he will be out of public view as he is moved from the car into the wheelchair. There was an unspoken rule among news reporters, and it was one that was adhered to, that you did not show the president in transit, you did not show him in a weakened position. So they move him into the wheelchair, they take him up to the Speaker's office. At the stroke of 12, he comes out. And that is now where the book begins. Because everything that I've described to you, which I spent weeks writing, has been cut out. But remember, we serve the story first, the history second. Remember also what Gore Vidal once said, those who get their history from historical fiction get the history they deserve. However, it was the largest radio audience in history. On the cold coast of Maine, they were listening. Down on Wall Street, trading stopped so they could listen. On assembly lines in Detroit, they were taking long lunches so the auto workers could listen. In Chicago, the butchers stopped slaughtering in the stockyards to listen. In Kansas and Nebraska and Iowa, where they grew corn and wheat enough to feed the world, now that the rains had returned and the dust had stopped blowing, the farmers were listening there too. In all the places where the muscle and sinew of America bound one state or town or family to another, they were listening for the warm baritone and patrician inflections that somehow never sounded too upper crusty coming out of the radio. Because America had awakened that morning to the cold reality of war. War in every time zone, war encircling the earth, war once more as the original human fact. In Hawaii, U.S. Navy battleships burned beneath great funerary clouds of black oil smoke. In the far Pacific, Japanese troops attacked along every line of latitude and longitude. In swirling blizzards of blood and snow, Russians and Germans slaughtered each other before Moscow. Across Europe, jackboots echoed and resistance guttered, while U-boats stalked freighters on the roiling gray Atlantic. But Americans were listening because Franklin Roosevelt was about to make sense of it all. In Washington, the CBS radio announcer was describing the packed house, the tense atmosphere, when suddenly his voice rose. And now, ladies and gentlemen, the president is appearing and moving toward the podium. And from out of deep bass consoles and tinny tabletop radios in every corner of the country, a roar exploded. Something between a cheer and an angry shout. The harsh, hard, ferocious cry of Americans lifting themselves from shock and drawing strength from the president who'd lifted himself from a wheelchair and by remarkable force of will was standing upright before them. When the roar receded, the speaker announced, "Senators and representatives, I have the distinguished honor of presenting the President of the United States." More cheers and shouts. Then Franklin Roosevelt's voice rang out, firm, confident, indignant. "Mr. Vice President, Mr. Speaker, members of the Senate and the House of Representatives, yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan." In the West, radio stations had gone off the air the night before so that Japanese bombers couldn't home in on their broadcasts. But now Roosevelt's voice rolled across deserts, up and over mountain ranges, and down into the warm green dream of Southern California, down along boulevards laid like gridwork atop lettuce fields and orange groves, down onto long, straight, relentless thoroughfares that ended where scrub-covered hillsides leapt up to divide the expanse of Los Angeles, down into offices and coffee shops and cars where people were listening. unaware that as Roosevelt spoke, a Nazi assassin was shooting at targets in a local canyon and planning the most daring act of the age. Unaware also that before it was over, he would draw many of them into his dark orbit. You read that, you'll read the next page, I guarantee you. We are now in the location where the book really begins, Los Angeles. We are with the Nazis. Why did I begin in Los Angeles on December 8th? Because on that day, the FBI fanned out across the city and started arresting first Japanese nationals and others that they had their eye on, and then they turned on the Germans. They arrested about 250 Japanese that day and about 65 Germans. And some of the Germans were arrested in a place, or German sympathizers, some of them were arrested in a place that you can still visit today, that I read about in Smithsonian or some magazine maybe 10 years ago, long before I wrote this book, and I said, this is going to be in a book someday. If you drive out Sunset Boulevard into Pacific Palisades, when you come to the Riviera Country Club on the left side, take a right, go up the hill. You drive up the hill into a neighborhood where Steven Spielberg lives today. You drive through the neighborhood, you get to the top, you go around the big houses at the top, and there's a fire road that leads back into the Santa Monica Mountains. You travel on the fire road for maybe a half a mile or so, and you will come to a giant chain link fence. This is the Murphy Ranch, except there ain't no Murphy and it ain't a ranch. This property was purchased from the estate of cowboy comedian Will Rogers, who owned the other side where Will Rogers State Park is today, back in 1933. Fascist sympathizers bought it and began upgrading it, first with the fence, then with a 300-foot staircase that leads down into the canyon. They put in power plant, water tanks, fuel tanks. They terraced areas for gardens, and they hired a Los Angeles architect to design a mansion, the plans of which can still be found in the UCLA archives, a mansion that was to have been Hitler's Western White House. That was the talk, anyway. And in this canyon would practice all sorts of fascist groups, the Silver Shirt League, the Friends of the New Germany, which became the German-American Bund, the Ku Klux Klan, and other groups like that. And I thought to myself, the FBI raided that, what a great scene that's going to make. They raid that place, everybody gets away except for one guy. And that one guy is the one they should have, or everybody is arrested except for that one guy, and he's the one they should have caught, because he's the one that has to get to Washington to kill FDR. That's how the story begins. But why Germans and fascists in Los Angeles? Because, first of all, the FBI throughout the 30s had been worried more about the communists than the Nazis. The LAPD, in many instances, was downright friendly to the fascist organizations. The only group that was really watching them was a group called the Los Angeles Jewish Community Committee. Jewish war veterans who recognized the threat that Hitler represented, and they brought into their fold Gentiles who agreed with them and would help them and would infiltrate groups like the German-American Bund. One of my characters does this in the book. Now, the German-American Bund of Los Angeles was on Figueroa and 14th Street. Beautiful clubhouse, where the Staples Center is today. And you could walk into the Bund Hall, and to your left, you could go into the Aryan bookstore. In the Aryan bookstore, you could buy German literature, German cookbooks, and all the anti-Semitic literature you wanted. If you turned to the right, you could go into the Gaststube, where you would get all kinds of wonderful German foods and drink German beers on red checkered tablecloths, just like in the beer halls in Munich. And on the walls were maps with pushpins showing the advances of the German army across Europe. And in the center was a massive hall where they had their parties and their Oompa bands and their dances and their rallies, where they would appear in brown shirts, or sometimes in white shirts and Sam Brown belts, where they had all of the hierarchy that they had learned from their German cousins back in Munich and places like that, and where on April 23rd every year, they put up big pictures of the Fuhrer and marched around and celebrated Hitler's birthday. All of this was happening in Los Angeles throughout the 30s and into the early 40s. The Bund would send an agent to every ship that arrived from Germany to sit down with the Gestapo agent who was aboard every ship that came from Germany into Long Beach. And that Gestapo agent would have brought orders, he would have brought literature, and most importantly, he would have brought cash, because cash would work very well in helping them to advance their cause and hatch their plans. One of their plans was to persuade Americans, disaffected soldiers from 1918, the kind of men who had been in the Bonus March, persuade them to start stealing weapons from National Guard armories up and down the West Coast and putting them in a central place where they could all get them when Der Tag arrived. Der Tag was, in German, it means the day. And it was talked about extensively, the day when we will rise up and start shooting all the wrong people and start putting the right people into office. This was conversation that was going on across this country, and particularly in Los Angeles at the time. They also hatched a plan that never came to fruition to kidnap Harry Cohn, Louis B. Mayer, Samuel Goldwyn, Jack L. Warner, all the Jewish movie executives, kidnap them all on the same day and take them up to a place called Hindenburg Park above Los Angeles and hang them all. That never happened either. But what fertile, and I guess you could say fetid as well, what fertile ground from out of which you can build a novel. And so you will feel that environment. You will be there. You will know what it was like in this novel. There's another reason I begin on December 8th, because not only is it a World Historical Day, it is a significant day in the history of American popular culture. And popular culture in the 30s and 40s was enormously important to the psychological well-being of the American people. On December 8th, a pile of material arrived at Warner Brothers. It came from New York, sent out by the story editor in New York. Books, plays, material to be read by young readers who would be paid $1.12 an hour in order to do reports and say whether a particular piece of material would make a good movie or not. And on that day, a play called Everybody Comes to Rick's arrived. Really. And when I read that, I said, the play that will become Casablanca, perhaps the most important war movie of the war, a war movie in which there are no battles, except internal battles, that play arrived on that very day. I have to work with that. I don't make any kind of parallels. There's no big love triangle in this book. The love triangle is dispensed with early. But there's a scene in this book, in the movie, which kind of exemplifies the whole idea that I'm trying to get to in this book. Ingrid Bergman has finally visited Sam's Club. Now she's gone, she's left. Humphrey Bogart is crushed. He hates seeing her again, so he's sitting there in the semi-darkness after the club has closed. He's got the bourbon bottle in front of him, and Sam's behind him tinkling on the piano, and Bogart says, "Sam, it's December 1941 in New York, in Casablanca. What time is it in New York?" And Sam says, "I don't know, my watch has stopped." And Bogey says, "I bet they're asleep in New York. I bet they're asleep all over America." And then he goes on from there. And the rest of the movie is going to be about the way in which Bogart awakens to the new realities of war and the new responsibilities that confront him as war forces everyone to recognize the responsibilities that they have. And that's what I've done with this book. That's how I see the evolution of my good guy characters in this book. So when you read this novel, you will feel like you are back there in the 40s, in the movies. It's a black and white movie in many ways. It's a film noir in the first third. Then the characters are all going to get on a train, the Santa Fe Super Chief, and it becomes a cat and mouse thriller on the train. And then it will conclude in Washington, D.C., like a Hitchcockian thriller with all the great monuments of American democracy surrounding it. You will be steeped in American popular culture as you read this. You will learn things that perhaps you may already know, but would be surprised at. What was the #1 song on December 6, 1941 on the Billboard chart? Glenn Miller and the Orchestra, Chattanooga Choo Choo. But there's another reason that I choose December 8th, the third reason, and that is because, going back into world politics, Winston Churchill on that day, after he had heard all the speeches and all the wars were declared between the United States and Japan on Great Britain, told his staff, we need to get to Washington right away. We need to look Franklin Roosevelt in the eye as soon as possible. We need to make sure that he doesn't focus entirely on the Japanese. The immediate fear was that that was what was going to happen because the Germans hadn't declared war on America, America hadn't declared war on Germany. So he immediately shoots off a cable, and Franklin Roosevelt holds him off. Oh, Winston, you're too important. Stay where you are. We wouldn't want you to have an accident coming over here. Much more important that you stay there, because Roosevelt knows what Churchill will be after. Roosevelt is also doing his part to bring the American people to the realization that this is going to be a two-front war. On Tuesday night, December 9th, he has a fireside chat. People believe that Roosevelt had fireside chats like every week of the 12 years of his presidency, but the fact is that he only gave 53 fireside chats. And in that one, he said to the American people, it will ill behoove us to defeat the Empire of Japan, only to turn and find that Germany and Italy are in control of the rest of the world. So he was working in the same direction that Churchill was working. Well, on Thursday of that week, Adolf Hitler made this point moot because Hitler declared war on the United States, much to the shock of his own general staff, because they had never planned for a war with the industrial colossus on the other side of the Atlantic. Hitler said, we are at war anyway, so let's just make it official. Immediately, FDR told Churchill, Winston, get here as soon as you can. So Churchill, the next day, traveled to Scotland, and on the morning after that, boarded HMS Duke of York, sister ship of the Prince of Wales, which had just been sunk in the Pacific, and he headed for America. He called the trip the 10 worst days of the war. He wrote this to his wife in a letter. Crossing the Atlantic on a battleship in December cannot be a pleasant experience. And members of his staff broke bones as the ship rolled up and down. Other members of the staff had concussions, fell and hit their heads and had concussions. Churchill had trouble communicating with London. They worked out all kinds of means by which he could do it without alerting the German U-boats. He would entertain himself by, well, first of all, by dosing himself with Mother Sill's seasick remedy, and also by reading C.S. Forester novels and watching Hollywood movies. And on the Saturday night before he arrives in the United States, they watched The Seahawk with Errol Flynn. And as the story goes, Churchill was sitting down front, getting more and more excited as the battle approaches. And when Errol Flynn leads his men up out of the dungeon of the ship to assail the Spanish, he leaps up and starts screaming, "The English are winning! The English are winning!" And then, of course, after the movie was over, he'd go and he'd write the series of reports that he was going to present to Franklin Roosevelt about how the war should be fought over the next couple of years. When they arrive at the Virginia Capes, he informs his staff and the people in Washington that he can't stay with the current plan, which is to steam up to Washington and arrive there on Tuesday, December 23rd. He says, I need to get to the president right away. It's Monday, December 22nd. They get him a plane in Norfolk. He gets onto the plane. Tommy Thompson, his bodyguard, is on the plane. Lord Moran and Lord Beaverbrook are also in this small aircraft, which will only take an hour to get to Washington. It travels up the Chesapeake, and as it does, about 5:30 in the afternoon, it's dark now, it's December, they're looking out the windows, and all of them are silent, till finally Churchill turns to Tommy Thompson and says, "What do you see?" And Tommy Thompson says, "I see lights, but I see more than lights. I see freedom." For the first time in 2 years, they are seeing a landscape that is illuminated at night. They have been under the threat of the German bombs for all that time. And it's a moment that's written about by Lord Moran. He also describes the plane arriving at the Anacostia Naval Air Station. Churchill bounds off the plane, and there is Franklin Roosevelt standing next to the limousine to shake his hand and welcome him to America. The car drives them back to the White House, and a photograph is taken on the White House lawn that shocks the world. It is a photograph showing the president in the middle with his naval aide helping him here, standing, and Winston Churchill next to him. Nobody knew where Churchill was going. The German intelligence had him headed for North Africa, and here he was sitting down with Franklin Roosevelt for the Arcadia Conference. The next day, they had meetings, and then finally we get to Christmas Eve. Now, my German assassin has opened the newspaper on the morning after Churchill's arrival and seen the photograph. Oh, by the way, he makes it to Washington. You don't write a book in which you have on the cover a Zeiss 39 scope and not have the bad guy look through that scope before the book is over. But as I say, I don't change history, just the characters are changed by history. He opens the paper, he sees the picture, and he says, "I can get them both. I can end the war tonight." And so the stakes are suddenly cranked that much higher. But he won't end the war that night. He won't get them. You need to read the book to find out how it happens. You need to read the book to find out who lives and who dies. And before you read the book, I hope that you'll go to my website and look at a timeline that I put together of events that occurred in December of 41. They're all YouTube videos. Some of them are movie previews, because I'm giving you the popular culture. But a lot of it is political. There's a captured Japanese newsreel about the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And the most important bit of footage, and one of the most amazing pieces of historical film, one of the most intimate pieces of historical film that you will ever see, is shot on Christmas Eve there on the South Portico. The camera is set up right here. It's the British Pathé News Service, the newsreel company from England. And they put the camera right there and just let it roll for about 15 minutes. And you see Franklin Roosevelt at the podium, Winston Churchill behind him. They talk to each other, they turn, they're totally unaware of the fact that they're being filmed. Franklin Roosevelt is at the podium, and his voice rings out, "And now, for the 9th time, I light the living community Christmas tree of Washington, D.C." You see, hear him press the button, you hear the bells chime, you hear the audience applaud. He then gives his speech, which begins significantly with these words, "Fellow workers in freedom." He then delivers his speech, and then he introduces his old and good friend Winston Churchill, who steps to the podium and gives an amazing speech about the importance of Christmas and the importance of celebrating Christmas in this particular year. And at the end of it, he says, "So let the children have their night of fun and laughter. Let the gifts of Father Christmas delight their play. Let us grown-ups join in their unstinting pleasures. before we return to the stern task and formidable year that lies before us, resolved that by our sacrifice, those same children shall not be robbed of their inheritance or denied their right to live in a free and decent world. And so, in God's good grace, a happy Christmas to you all. He steps back and his voice reaches all around the world. BBC is carrying it. CBS is carrying it. All of the English-speaking peoples or English-comprehending peoples hear this special ode to Christmas. And as you're reading the book, remember that if my characters don't step out of themselves and do the things that history demands of them, even though they're simple people, that Nazi would have shot them both and stopped Churchill from ever giving that speech. So this is where I usually end, but since we've talked a little bit about Veterans Day, I want to just, in the last few weeks, we only passed Veterans Day last week, and I know that we talked about speaking about Veterans Day a little bit. I've been thinking about what those speeches and speeches like them mean as they relate to Veterans Day. And I begin to think to myself, well, what makes and has made throughout our history soldiers, men and women, do what, as I write in my novel Annapolis, they are called upon to do, which is, whether they want it or not, to stand where God puts them. Whether we're talking about Christmas night 1776, on the banks of the Delaware River as we're ready to cross into Trenton, or whether we're talking about a regiment in the Civil War that was raised right here on the coast of Maine, the 20th Maine, marching up the hill at Fredericksburg in December of 1862, or standing on the far left of the Federal line 6 months later at Gettysburg, or whether we're talking about Omaha Beach. I was reading about Omaha Beach last night. A friend of mine has just come back from there, and she brought me a new guidebook, and I was reading it, looking at some of the maps and images. You know, what made those men in those boats at Omaha Beach do what they did? On the right, you had the 29th Infantry Regiment, which was a young and inexperienced regiment, probably terrified because they did not know what they were about to face when they hit that beach. And on the left, you had the veteran Big Red 1, the 1st Infantry Division, probably terrified because they did know what they were about to face when they hit that beach. And they all did it. They all stood where God put them. And I think to myself of the words of the historian Stephen Ambrose, who wrote Band of Brothers, D-Day, numerous other books. He once did an interview in which he talked about how little Hitler fully understood the American people. And he said Hitler did not understand that he had to beware the power of an aroused democracy. And what helps to arouse the democracy and persuades those people to be the sharp spear points that will allow democracy to survive and advance through history? Well, think of 1776, what happened. On Christmas night, 165 years before that event that I have referred to here, on Christmas night, Thomas Paine's American Crisis was read to the troops before they crossed the Delaware River. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot shall shrink in the present crisis. But he that stands it now deserves the love and respect of man and woman. The 20th Maine, which was comprised of farmers, fishermen, loggers, lawyers, was led by a professor from Bowdoin, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, who was not only a professor of Romance languages and literature, but also of rhetoric. And you can be sure that Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain had listened to and understood and internalized and expressed to his troops the things that Lincoln had provided the American people in speeches that had cold nuggets of logic surrounded by levels of poetry that were undeniable. Lincoln was a genius, a rhetorical genius. And to those men who went ashore on Omaha Beach, they were inspired by many things we know, but one of them was the powerful rhetoric of Franklin Roosevelt and of Winston Churchill, which you could hear and can hear when you go on the website. You can hear it that very night, that very Christmas, and the day after Christmas, when Churchill stepped before the United States Congress in a joint session and gave one of his second most famous speeches of this trip. It's a speech in which he describes the depredations of the Nazis and the Japanese and the challenges that lie before us. And then comes the galvanizing moment when he looks out and says, "What kind of people do they think we are? Is it possible that they do not understand that we shall never cease to persevere against them until they and their henchmen have been taught a lesson that they and the world shall never forget?" And the explosion of applause in the Senate chamber that day was as powerful as the explosion of applause I've described to you in this book. When we think about Veterans Day, when we think about the importance of these people who served as the spear points of our aroused democracy, we have to remember the rhetoric that gave them a reason to be who they were, that gave them the inspiration, that crystallized their beliefs for them, because it's all reflected in the words of men like Paine and Lincoln and Roosevelt and Churchill. Men who, in the words of Edward R. Murrow, when he spoke of Winston Churchill at the end of the war, weaponized the English language and sent it into battle. So that is the most important thing I think we can say about the power of the rhetoric of these leaders and its impact upon the veterans who stood where God put them. And in God's good grace, a happy holiday season to you all, and thank you for listening. Sure.
The rhetoric of this man is phenomenal. Questions, folks?
Well, I'd like to make a
Yes, sir.
comment. In 1941, I was a kid, 6.5 years old, and on December 7th, my dad and I, we lived in a little town about 30 miles south of New York City. We're in a car headed to take me to the Bronx Zoo for the very first time.
Yeah.
And the message came across about parole.
Oh.
My dad turned around, took me home, and I never got to get to the Bronx Zoo.
Oh.
But then, we lived about a block and a half away from the railroad, and for the next 4 years, every afternoon we would go down and watch the trains coming into New York City loaded with the tanks and the anti-aircraft guns and everything else.
Yeah. Yes.
Such memories, you bring them back.
Yes. Well,
Oh,
it was, yeah.
I look forward
He-
to reading.
Thank you. Thank you. He's talking about the memories of, if you didn't hear, about the memories that discussions of World War II bring back for him. And I thank you. I appreciate that. Is there anything else?
I might add, I joined
Yes, sir.
the Air Force in 1954,
Yep.
stationed in England, went to London, and London, 8 years after the war was over, was still in terrible condition.
Yeah. Yeah.
Buildings were gone, and it was just
Right.
so
Right. War was the original human fact, as I write in the book. And every generation thinks they can end it, but it doesn't always happen. Anything else? Well, let me just guarantee you that, when I was writing the Lincoln letter, I was staying up late trying to finish that book because I wanted to hit a particular deadline so that we could publish it on the anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. And so I was staying up until midnight writing, and I hate doing that. I hated doing that when I was younger, and I don't like doing it now. But one day, I just write and write and write, and I get my characters all the way through the big scene in Washington, D.C., and they pull up in front of Ford's Theater in the coach, and they get out, and they look up at the illuminated theater, the big lanterns in front. They look at the soldiers who were playing cards on the stoop in front of Ford's Theater on Good Friday night, 1865. And I thought to myself, good, it's midnight. I can go to bed now. And just then, the door of the Star Saloon banged open, and this athletic young actor in a pork pie hat walked out, walked up, turned to me, and he said, "You don't want to go to bed yet, Bill. Come on inside and see what happens next." And the camera of my imagination followed Booth into the Ford's Theater and up the stairs and into the dress circle, and I stayed up all night to finish that scene. And when you get to Christmas Eve in this book, I guarantee you that you too will stay up all night to finish the book. Thank you all for listening. And one other thing, I was talking about the rising of the moon. Everybody have a look at this. You're going to see the photograph of me at 29 and realize I pretty much haven't changed a day. And neither has my wife.
So George and Pat, we want to thank you for always being supporters of the Graves Library and for bringing us such great guests. And we can't let you go home without some swag.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Oh, I need a nice hat.
There we go.
How's that?
New color, sir.
Oh, and coffee. Is that coffee?
Yeah,
Coffee to get me through the day.
there you go. Thank you so
Great.
much for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you all for being with us. Whenever we put these things together, we always is anyone going to come? But you know, you are a tried and true group, so we really appreciate all of you being here and supporting the library and to keep coming back to programs like this. We love to do them, so thank you very much.
And when I finish another book, I'll come back to it.
Oh, good.
Thank you.